Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ask Mayfield Anything. We're going to get started in just a minute here. We're just allowing people to log in. Okay. All right, welcome and thank you for joining us for this month's Ask Mayfield Anything. This is a monthly live Q&A session on technical topics, and you can visit some of our past recorded AMA sessions in case you missed the previous topics. It's on our website and also on our YouTube channel. We are recording this right now, and we'll be posting it onto our YouTube channel later, as well as sending out a recap. And you can submit questions while we're chatting today. So I think everyone's pretty familiar with Zoom at this point, but in case you forgot, there's a Q&A button at the bottom. Please submit your questions using the Q&A and not the chat feature. It really helps us keep track of which questions we've already answered if you put them in the Q&A. And yeah, with that, I will introduce our guest. So first off, my name's Jennifer Alfsen. I am with Mayfield Renewables. I am the Director of Business Development, and I'm joined here today with Ryan Mayfield, the founder and CEO of Mayfield Renewables. And Ryan's been in the industry since 1999 and founded our company back in 2007. And he has a huge heart and a big passion for solar. We're honored to have him as our CEO. So thanks for joining us today, Ryan.
Yep, of course. Thanks for letting me join. This is going to be a fun conversation, so I'm really looking forward to this.
All right. And our guests today, we have two wonderful guests. Stan Pipkin is currently the CEO of Lighthouse Solar in Austin, Texas. And along with running a regional solar EPC, other endeavors combine in addressing the challenges of effectively deploying distributed solar resources. As a principal at the architectural design firm Pipkin, how do I say that? Pimp Inc.
Pimp, yeah.
Pimp Inc. I like it.
It's designed to confuse. I don't get a lot of business because of that.
It's definitely a conversation starter. So as a co-founder of a customer experience software firm, 17 terawatts, Stan brings a holistic approach to the challenge of integrating solar technologies into the built world from a customer perspective. Other associations that he's involved in include Solar Austin and Architectural Solar Association and SPURS. Stan has been in the solar industry for 12 years and in the architectural field for 20. He also holds a Master's of Architecture from the University of Texas at Austin. So thanks for joining us today, Stan.
Yeah, thank you. Looking forward to it.
And we also have with us today Jeanine Cotter, and she is the president of Luminalt, a solar and solar paired storage design build firm based in San Francisco. In 2004, she co-founded Luminalt with her husband, Noel Carter, 7 months pregnant with their third child. Oh my goodness. Jeanine is Luminalt's C46 solar specialty contractors license qualifier. And she's widely recognized for the caliber and experience, or Luminalt is widely recognized for the caliber and expertise of diverse and talented craftspeople, and for the quality of the systems it designs and builds. We're very excited to have you on today, Jeanine, with your wealth of knowledge in the solar and storage industry, and my not too far neighbor. Welcome, Jeanine.
Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer. I'm glad to be here. And thanks, Ryan, for inviting me. And I'm excited about the topic. It's really timely and very important. So thank you.
Absolutely. And last but certainly not least, we have Jeanine Sanchez, another colleague of ours from Mayfield Renewables. And Justine is an industry veteran, has been in the industry for over 20 years, and is really our guru when it comes to PV plus storage system design. She has been heading our education and creating workshops around energy storage. And she is the perfect person to really pick her brain in terms of codes and standards and compliance. She was also a SEI trainer and for decades and provides a wealth of knowledge. So thanks for joining us tonight, Justine.
Always happy. Yeah. Solar plus storage. Gotta be there.
Yeah, so let's get into our topic for today. So we really wanted to address, there's been so many things happening around the country that has caused this increased demand for energy storage systems, particularly homeowners wanting to have backup in the event of these extreme weather conditions. So what happened just more recently in Texas with the extreme blizzard that went through Texas, and then also here in California with all of the wildfires that basically just completely shut down and destroyed so much of the state. So I think most people are pretty familiar with those things happening, but I wanted to start just with Texas and maybe give an overview of what exactly was the issue of why the entire grid shut down, right? People were out of power for days. I mean, it became a life and death situation with temperatures dropping and people unable to leave their homes, completely snowed in. So what exactly happened with the energy grid? Why was it such a disaster? And Stan, maybe you can answer this, being from Texas and experiencing it.
Well, yeah, thank you, Jennifer. I think it's a question that is getting kind of unraveled, looked at really closely right now in the PUC in Texas and just across the state. I think there's a number of layers, but it's probably worth saying, this is what I consider a black swan event. I'm from Texas, like you said. The extreme cold was one, so record cold and precipitation. But then the real issue is that it basically blanketed the entire state at one time. Texas, I think there's some stat that says Texas has, one of the highest insurance claims for natural disasters, by and large, tornadoes and hurricanes, which are inherently very regional, so either coastal or very acute. I think what happened here, because it blanketed the entire state, it essentially was the same territory as ERCOT. And for those that may or may not be familiar, Texas takes its independence very seriously. ERCOT is its own grid by and large, and it's roughly the state of Texas. There's some areas that aren't in ERCOT, but it's the management of Texas grid is inside Texas. And so the problem overlaid the entire state all at the same time and for duration. And I think much of what has been uncovered is, apart from the politics, there's been statements from the governor blaming renewables. Turns out they performed fine. They weren't expected to do too much during this potential winter peak. It was the thermal plants that didn't come online. So the percentage that I've read is basically about a third of the capacity that was expected for a winter peak was just offline. And so that was poor weatherization. There was no planning, and the reasons why that wasn't, why it was in a poor state of preparedness, I think then becomes a very gnarly question of how to protect ourselves in the future. We did have an outage, or I should say a freeze event in 2011. The recommendation was made, unfortunately not very forcefully, to weatherize our thermal plants by and large, and that wasn't done. And so this was an event just even more severe than that one. And the grid just couldn't catch up. There was really no power available. We came very close to actually having no fuel available from a natural gas perspective, which would have deepened the calamity and probably more loss of life. So far, 110 fatalities from this event, which is remarkable. 200 billion in damages, 4.5 million homes out of power, and it's just a everybody felt it at the same time. I think that was what was quite unusual.
Mm-hmm. What areas were out of? What was the longest that folks were out of power in some spots?
I think there have been there are different forms of outages. There were the controlled curtailment, and the way that was distributed around the grid was based on your proximity to critical feeders. So some people didn't lose power. We did with a partner company, 17 terawatts, we conducted a very informal survey just to kind of gauge public perception. And out of that, 3/4 of the people lost power. The duration is up to 60, 70 hours. So it's multiple days. For some folks, it was periodic. So it was like a rolling blackout. For others, it was continuous. And then there were actual, transformer outages, which would be more typical, where the grid itself, just the distribution grid, failed. And I would say within that, there were communication problems. The particular utilities responding to those outages, they didn't have robust, emergency communication protocols in place. So people really didn't know what was happening. They knew there was an outage, but they didn't have a good timeline of when it would be, fixed or remediated. So I think that added to the anxiety in real time. And then water is probably the thing that is still, some areas are still dealing with. Just the number of broken pipes is really probably the heaviest cost, and sort of a latent problem. So, infrastructure, both electricity and water, the obvious, but transportation was affected. We are a state not prepared for winter, and I think it's a running joke, but it's really true. Most of the urban areas in Texas are just below the deep freeze line. So, I think we had critical infrastructures all teetering, some failing, and getting food and water to people once these things broke just exacerbated the problem. So we're talking about power, but I think it was a broader set of failures for sure.
Right. And so really, I mean, it sounds like just a collection of the perfect storm that really wiped out and overwhelmed the entire system. You're saying, not enough energy to supply the demand, and I'm assuming also probably higher demands if it was getting so cold, and people worrying about not having their pipes freeze and even just surviving in those cold conditions. So that led to blackouts, prolonged power outages, massive damage, and loss of life. And just to pause a sec, you painted a great picture of kind of what the scene was in Texas and what they're dealing with. And I'm glad you brought up the infrastructure in ERCOT, because one thing that I think is really important to note is we are essentially in this energy revolution right now, where the grid was set up in a way that is just not conducive to how we are living our lives now. It was built in a way where you have one giant massive power plant that supplies huge areas, and the utilities traditionally control all of that and distribute it. And that's how their businesses are set up, which is why there's so many issues and it becomes such a political nightmare, and we get into all of these infrastructure issues. And so just painting that picture, and I want to pause there and turn to California and paint the picture there, and then pick up with, how do we address this issue with storage? So Jeanine, turning to California, a lot of similar issues happened. Obviously, a different natural disaster, I mean, I'm here in Berkeley in Northern California, and when the fires hit, I mean, the amount of smoke, I grew up here. We joke around, you know, around August, September, like, oh, okay, when's the state gonna just turn ablaze? Because it happens so frequently now. We're kind of used to these massive wildfires, unfortunately. But this was unbelievable. I mean, I went outside and it literally blocked the sun. It
Yes.
looked like the apocalypse. I mean, it was something I had never seen before for days. Like, you literally could not see the sun. There was so much smoke blanketing the sky. So talk to me about what happened in California. Why was California equally not prepared and able to handle what happened here?
Actually, a fair number of similarities between Texas and California, with some notable exceptions. In California, the utility lines were part of the problem. They were an ignition source for a number of the wildfires. And as a result of that, the utilities started taking down power, parts of the power system, parts of the electricity grid. And so people had public safety power shutdowns as part of a reaction to these wildfires. So there were sort of semi-controlled power shutdowns to ensure that, to mitigate the chance of fires starting from utility-owned power equipment. And so those sort of blackouts were planned, essentially. You know, I think the largest common denominator, of course, is climate change. That's what was behind both Texas and California's changing climate. And the centralized sort of distribution of power is a weak link in that sort of new environment. So the point that you made about the electricity system and how it's centralized distribution and we just sort of receive it was part of the problem. And so renewables and battery storage are part of the solution.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that in terms of the infrastructure, because it sounds like in California, it wasn't so much of a supply issue as it was in Texas, but more of a distribution issue of the way that the grid is set up, the way that it's controlled by the utilities is not conducive to be able to handle these things. And it makes perfect sense to shut off part of the grid if it is dangerous and could cause additional fires, then of course that should be shut off, but then that shouldn't also shut down other areas that don't need to be shut down if they're safe to operate. So and that kind of gets into the concept of distributed energy and microgrids, and you know, how do we deal with this, because the technology is here. So how can we mitigate some of these things in the future? Like, what do you see as some of the solutions for addressing this?
Well, definitely behind the meter solar and storage, or even ahead of the meter solar and storage that's community based. So you're not focused on having your power delivered from far away. Having community based renewables and storage is a huge part of resiliency and will be a huge part of the evolution of the grid in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing that now.
Yeah. And Stan, have you been seeing an increased demand from your own customers wanting to put storage in, either totally new customers or maybe even solar people who put a solar system in before and then now given the state of this energy grid, realizing, oh shoot, it might be worth it to put some batteries into. Oh, you're muted, Stan.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. On both counts, we've seen really since the Texas blackout, there's been a tremendous surge in interest, and that was already on top of what I would say just the turn of the year, the new administration. I think the signaling towards renewables was already ascendant, and this has really energized that quite a bit. It's been curious. So one point just on the survey that we did that I think runs maybe to your question. The majority of folks answering, pointing towards what the fixes are, they actually point towards some form of better regulation, which I think in some ways points to the fact that we don't really understand how our grid works. We just expect it to work. And that's at the level of the outlet in the house or in the building. You expect it on demand, perfect power. And when that failed, there really wasn't, it was very opaque, like where to get the answer. So I'd say we had a very enthusiastic cohort of folks looking for solar plus storage, or just adding storage to existing solar. And those were folks that were probably already leaning, they were already interested in, taking the matter in their own hands, and they looked to that solution as something they could provide, their personal resilience. There was I think an equally large percentage of folks sort of generally that said someone else needs to fix this. Generally speaking, and Texas is not known for regulation. We had a meager RPS for wind. It was very successful, but we haven't had anything for solar. So maybe unlike California, we really haven't had leadership at the legislative level. But when faced with this kind of large scale issue, I think people are sort of left to their own devices. And so the interest in solar, and this I think sets up what has become a challenge for us, is folks want to solve the problem for themselves, but in a way that would equal, a larger societal solution. So it needs to be the same as it was. And I think the interest we've seen, very robust, has come with a kind of new set of expectations and maybe lack of understanding of really, what is the problem that we're trying to solve. So I'd say those two things have been operating in parallel, and have made it an interesting problem to solve, for sure.
Yeah, definitely people seeing the value of putting in storage to be able to deal with the current situations. Ryan, do you mind just taking the slide down? Because I don't think we need it anymore. That we can see everyone's faces nice and big. And so Jeanine, I'm curious, how has the conversation changed when talking to some property owners from Luminalt, in terms of, have you seen a shift? We can still see your screen, Ryan.
Okay, that's what I thought. Can I just black it out?
We can just stop sharing.
Okay, I will do that.
How have you seen the conversation shift with talking to customers about energy storage?
Well, yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting right now, just because Stan kind of foreshadowed the customer expectation, right? That people just want and need to be able to turn on the lights when they need to turn on the lights. You just need power when you need power. There are a lot of people in California and Texas that rely on power for medical devices and other things, where there's just like really critical loads in our homes that just have to be met because they're critical to sustaining human life. Water pumping for your home, that's the only way you have access to water, which is another corollary to what happened in Texas. So there's been a lot of demand just to make sure that people can have power when the public safety power shutdown happens. And then there's also a number of folks who are really interested in being able to benefit from the time of use and shifting their usage, because now the utilities are really following a model of time of use, so that we've put so much solar on the grid in California, both ahead of the meter and behind the meter, that we've changed the duck curve, we've changed the power. And so now demand for power really peaks between 4 and 9 p.m. And so storage is also a response to that. So storage is actually a response to resiliency and the power loss in a catastrophe like a public safety power shutdown to mitigate wildfires or to address a black swan weather event. But it also is a solution to us being able to drive more renewables. But the challenge still remains that people have this expectation of what a battery can do without really understanding that your capacity is fairly limited.
Yeah, and it sounds like with this increased demand, people are coming to you and being proactive about, hey, I'm considering putting in this energy storage system, but maybe not really understanding what that means. Like, oh, you're not probably going to be able to afford to back up your entire home and be binge watching Netflix with the laundry running and your, whatever, everything on.
Right.
So what are some of the challenges? It sounds like you've already been alluding to them. What are some of the other challenges that you guys are facing with handling this increased ESS demand and the customer expectations? And Stan, are you seeing some of the same issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one way I've characterized it just in our team is that, in Texas, solar was a bit of the gateway drug to, a whole host of renewable and energy efficiency technologies. There's the ideal order of how this would all be deployed in a kind of rational and organized way in a grid. And then there's what people are drawn to. And solar has always been that leader. It's holds people's imagination. And I say, in the course of 2 weeks, that turned on its head, and now it's storage. And so storage, in the way that Jeanine is describing it, it serves all these other purposes, and it does some of those things very well in certain markets and certain utility environments. Mostly in Texas, it's been about backup, so reserve power, and so there's the financial side of what this looks like as a kind of entry into the renewable conversation is a bit upside down, and most of the folks that are interested, they understand that this is a choice to preserve their well-being, and so it comes with a different set of kind of calculus or different ROI, as it were. That's really not the conversation. But then when we talk about, it's still not inexpensive, so folks are cost conscious, and it needs to make sense against fuel-based solutions, generators. So we're one of the big challenges is just to discern the difference between a generator and storage fed by solar. And so it becomes a very technical description of what those limitations are, and it is tuned to the actual house. So what is the physicality of where this infrastructure will go often plays a much larger role than solar alone would be. So we're talking about different types of systems that need to integrate, different trades, potentially fuel sources or not, and then the actual energy density question that Jeanine is talking about has really been ramped up. So it's fewer folks are talking about critical circuits or critical backup, and fewer are talking about just kind of a convenience-based emergency backup, i.e. communication, some refrigeration, some fans. And now it's, it's resistance strip heating. And that would be the worst, that's the worst pairing that we could imagine. And it really, storage as it is today just can't meet that demand. So I'd say, parsing through all those expectations is now really on the front end. And I'd say every company is going to handle it slightly differently, but from a long-term customer sort of satisfaction and retention, we need to define those expectations really clearly at an individual level and then aim to meet them. And so that's put, I think, the onus on our industry to be much more intentional and transparent about, limitations and what a recommended, roadmap might be. So, and this is all in the context of, I need this because my life's in danger. So the stakes are much higher. It's no longer an annuity or an energy hedge or, a good thing to do. It's got a bit sharper, attitude about it. So, and that has made the conversation that much trickier to manage in a very, with integrity, I would say.
Right, really needing to educate the client and take the time to walk them through everything, make sure that they understand. And it sounds like customers are willing to listen a little bit more attentively, considering the stakes are higher, because it's not just a financial thing, because they are concerned about their safety and the safety of their families. They're willing to sit through that education and see, like, okay, what is the best option for me to be able to have backup and be resilient, but also be able to afford it. And this kind of brings up, in terms of the challenges of designing the system and installing it. And a question came in from the audience just now. And just a reminder to the audience, if you can please put your questions into the Q&A instead of chat, so I can keep track of which questions we've answered. That's really helpful. And in terms of just, why can't you just put a solar and throw a battery in there and you're done? And and that's generally the answer that most people want, but it's not that simple. And so, Ryan, maybe you can bring up that SLD that you were going to show. And Justine, this is a lot of what you deal with in terms of helping designers navigate this. So can you walk us through a grid tied system and then what an energy storage system looks like from a design perspective?
Yeah, I would go, before I do that, I wanted to go back to what Stan was saying. For those of us that have been in the industry a long time, all of us started in off-grid solar, and we all started with the load calculation. It was all based on, what do you want to run? And we had these little spreadsheets, load, watts, hours, watt hours, and we total them all up, and we get this kilowatt hour per day figure. And over here, a watts figure for how many watts at any one time we need to pull. And it was all started with the loads. And we'd break it down step by step by step and size a system. And they would be like, oh, that's $40,000. It would be like, well, maybe you don't have so many loads. And then you work from there. And so now, because we have our industry has been growing from the grid where we already have power, and all you're doing is looking at the utility bill and maybe trying to balance that out. I mean, all of that load analysis went away, essentially, or a lot of it did anyway. And so now, pardon?
No, just a lot of it did.
Yeah.
Right.
And so
people don't think about it anymore.
It used to be a much more difficult job to design a system back when it was off-grid solar only. And then it got pretty simplified during the strict grid tie years. And so now we're swinging back around to where we want power when the grid goes down, and we have to get back to that load calculation and what can we supply strictly from our solar and our battery since the grid is no longer there. And so we go from schematics, like a simple grid tie system, like we're seeing in front of us, where we're showing here like a little AC module or microinverter system, and you just, wire your string together, you're paralleling those microinverters, getting into a disconnect, backfitting your panel, and using, when the sun's shining and it's getting dumped into your local loads, and you're not using a ton, then extra goes off to the grid. You just kind of balance your meter and maybe get some financial benefits and some feel good credits, right? You're producing clean energy. But if we need to have power when the grid goes down, we need a lot more pieces of equipment. And so if you skip ahead, so here we're showing, like, let's say we have a fully packaged energy storage system that's going to have batteries packaged together with an inverter, UL 9540 listed, of course, and so on. And now we have some new, kind of slick interconnection equipment that can go with a lot of these packages to figure out how we're going to tie it all together and isolate ourselves from the grid when the grid goes down, so that when we are producing power, when there's an outage, we're not backfeeding it to the utility and shocking people like my husband who works on the utility lines. And so these are new components that a lot of the designers and installers are not used to installing, the energy storage and all the rules and safety considerations that go along with them. So now we have a new 2020 code that's in effect in a lot of places, or more places now, Texas, Colorado. It's not just Massachusetts. Now that we're in 2021, there are new code rules specific to energy storage that we're not familiar with, or a lot of us are not familiar with. And then there's the fire codes, which are very key. Every different jurisdiction's on a different potentially fire code cycle. Maybe somebody's on a 2015 cycle or 2018, and some are even looking forward to, like California this summer, being on a 2021 residential code cycle with very strict, stringent requirements for good reason. I mean, we are putting energy storage system. I mean, it's not just we have the ability to create power with these solar modules that are somewhat power limited. They are power limited. Now we've got this stored energy that we have to really treat differently and consider our how we're spacing them together, where they're going to go. We don't want to put them in a bedroom, and all kinds of other issues. And so we started basically creating classes to educate the industry on making that leap from straight grid tie only to implementing energy storage and the codes and standards that go around that and why they're so important. Is that a good overview, or should I keep going?
No, yeah, that's a great overview. I mean, I think you really illustrated the other side of this. We've been talking a lot about customer expectations and needing to educate them, but then there's also a lot of education needing to be done, even just as an industry of, okay, yeah, I have to deal with curbing the customer's expectations and making them understand that they're not probably going to be able to afford to back up their entire house, but then what equipment should I even be using for this application? How do all these components come together? What are the appropriate codes and standards, and navigating that? And I know there are quite a lot of changes there. So I guess, Ryan, what have you seen in terms of this shift? I know we've also been seeing on the design side probably an increased interest in the energy storage. I guess as the team, how has our design team been handling it?
Yeah, we've definitely been seeing an increase in it, and it is interesting. I mean, it feels like even just a couple of years ago, well, to everybody's point, we started with batteries, we evolved to these grid direct systems, and now we're coming back to storage. And for a while there, it really felt like a lot of contractors were getting asked about storage. It feels like the industry never got away from solar equals storage equals resiliency in the customer's minds, even though we had this whole grid tied experience there for however many 10, 15 years. And it feels like a lot of contractors were unselling storage systems to customers. A customer would come and say, hey, I really want to have storage with my PV system. And the answer was, well, that's really complex, that's really hard, and it's just going to cost you a lot of money. And I feel like that was kind of a standard answer. In some ways, not an untrue statement by any means, especially 5, 6, 7 years ago. But now the customers are seeing there's products out there where it's a lot more in your face. And so it's, I think, becoming harder to do that. And so it becomes, part of the answer was also because, quite honestly, I think a lot of the contractors just didn't feel comfortable with the storage. It's really easy to go just do a straight grid tie system, offset your bill. It's easy to calculate, easy to do. And then there's this idea of being a long-term partner with this homeowner on this energy storage system that needs maintenance, and it's going to have issues down the line. So I would say that's a big shift. We're getting away from kind of this unselling of it, if you will, and embracing it and really using it. One of the things that I've also seen in our early conversations, we talked about this, and it was the events in Texas, the events in California, and they're having pretty widespread, I think, impact across the country. Here in Oregon, even with the Texas incident, it feels like a lot more people are talking about what that means, and kind of it for some reason that seemed to hit home really well. We have here in Oregon, we also have power safety shutdowns, and the utilities were pretty quiet about it, and we haven't actually seen them. They've implemented them, or they've said they can do them. We haven't seen any yet, but I think it's one of those things, once it happens to you, then it becomes a much more dire situation, or much more real, I guess. And so, but it's been interesting to see, for me, it's been interesting to see how the impacts, or what's been happening in other states, how it's impacting people across the country thinking about this for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, you have a solar system. You yourself were thinking about putting a battery system in, right?
Oh, I've been thinking about a battery system for years. I'm one of those people. I'm just waiting for me to, how do I just slap it in, right? I just want to add it in, no big deal. But I mean, quite honestly, but to that point, I mean, even myself, yes, I do have a PV system, a grid direct system. I would love to have storage, but I'm also, you know, being the energy solar nerd that I am, also realizing what its limitations are. And I'm probably going to have, if I want to sustain a 2-week outage, I'm probably going to need to have some fuel-based solution as well. And so it's just putting all of those pieces together. And that's part of us as an industry educating the contractors, and the contractors educating the clients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so back to the educating the clients, you know, what are the best strategies? And I definitely want to hear from both of you, Stan and Jeanine, in terms of what are the strategies that you guys have been using that are most effective in managing, and this question actually came from Ezra Dragonson. Hi, Ezra, thanks for joining us. So what strategies have you been using that are most effective for managing customer expectations about energy storage? What tool are there, tools that you use, or how do you go about doing that?
For us, it's really a conversation about, is it going to be whole home, or is it going to be a partial backup situation? And talking about the configuration of their existing electrical system. You know, is it a recessed panel, a combo panel, and you can't get behind it? Right? I mean, there's so many. Are there loads that are above 30 amps? And so it actually is a much more fulsome discussion, redolent of what Justine was talking about, in terms of like, what are your loads? What's important to you? What do you need to back up? And that's really a big part of that conversation. And it's a huge educational process, because most people don't even label their panels correctly, let alone think about how their circuits are designed. And there's certainly, most individuals never ever thought about how that was organized with respect to having emergency backup power. Mm-hmm. And so it's a whole host of conversations about what's your electrical system, what's important to you, what do you feel like you need to back up? And if you're doing whole house backup, how long is that power going to last you? What do you need to be turning off to make sure that the power lasts for the time that you need it?
Right. So it's obviously a very customized solution for every single customer, every single homeowner, because you're having to go through and, like you just said, actually analyze every single major load. Okay, maybe the smaller ones aren't as important, but do you have a dishwasher? Do you have a laundry machine? Do you want your refrigerator on? All of those things. And seeing what is their goal. Are they talking about 2 days? Are you talking about a week? Like, do they have any critical medical equipment that they need to be running? So that sounds like a lot of time and energy to put into just one client. So I'm curious, Stan, like, how do you mitigate, choose, like, educating the client to the point where, hey, this isn't just an easy answer that I can give you. I can't just say, like, boom, this is the thing and this is how much it costs. You have to go through and do that exercise. So have you found ways of, how do you start to educate a client, but then make sure that the one that you're going to invest all that time in to go through that is actually worthwhile?
Yeah, very topical, and it's I can tell you conversations this morning were about this very thing. For me, it's been, we've had to look at our business model holistically and really understand, do we have the tools and the disposition to manage this at all? Solar, rooftop solar, just PV has it's commodified in many ways, and the industry is aimed for that, to lower the cost and it's streamline it, optimize it. All those things are excellent. And this question of storage now, the way Jeanine, we're experiencing the same thing. It's really a tailored, customized process. I mean, it's Men's Warehouse versus getting a suit minded from London somewhere. So that time and energy, we've made the commitment that we want to treat our customers with respect and transparency and honesty. Some frankly just won't survive that process. So we have a fairly forwarded front end selection process that's not to weed out customers, but it's to present that complexity in a way that can be digested. So it's through questions, exercises, presentation of available technologies. Many of the comments in the chat box are, it's an incredibly dynamic space, all kinds of solutions proposed and realized and future, and the customer is all of a sudden sort of thrust into that. So in some ways, we have to select customers that are kind of up for it. And some may just be interested in storage, but really they want solar and they'll do storage later. And they just come to the table, with under the mantle of storage. So it's a different kind of selection process. And then once we have a customer that is really interested and wants to work with us, we've had to develop a different approach where our workflow normally, and it's not customer facing, we do the design, the permitting, all those things sort of flow in the background. And for our model, a project manager is kind of leading that. We're trying to involve the customer and more of our staff, like literally more of our operations, kind of pulling the veil back and having them see how that design unfolds. And so one they're engaged with us, so we just imagine that if they stick with us, then they'll stick with us. And secondly, they're getting educated as we are sort of making those critical discernments about their particular system. So it's our business model is such that we don't offer a single storage technology, but several that have different capabilities. And so as we're making those selections and those choices based on the information we're collecting, they're participating. So that's the challenge there I've found, and we've been doing something similar for a while, but the sales staff itself has to be patient, and that's not always, they don't come with that per se. So we've had to develop also a culture that supports a type of patience that is kind of looking for the long game. And that didn't start with storage, but I think it's maybe it's compatible with the strategies to really facilitate this conversation. But I'd say if the business model is, do the same very fast, then this kind of tailored approach is really, really difficult. Because customers, the other thing is many of them won't forget, and they imagine this will work. in the way that they imagine it will work. And if that's not right, then it comes back to bite somebody, the industry for sure, but that, that particular company possibly. So, so I'd say it has been process and culture, business model, and then the tools. I think we actually are evolving those tools. That what Justine mentioned, we have the same clunky spreadsheets, and we're looking to adapt those into more, more customer facing, more sophisticated, and it's more participative, I would say, at this point. And some of the manufacturers already provide some of those things. A big issue, and I'll be quick, but it's, we're put in a position as a contractor to now be a trusted advisor designer, and that really hasn't been a part of the job description from an industry perspective. And I'd say that's going to require our industry, from my perspective, to change. So they need to trust us, really, as not just the vendor, but as a guide and an advisor that's navigating all these different technologies, all the codes, all the challenges, Justine, you mentioned, you laid out. We actually have to navigate it and make the best recommendation, and they need to trust us, and we need to engender that trust, as opposed to the manufacturer or other markets, because these things are rolling out in such a fragmented way. So that's something I'd say companies will need to aspire to really be successful in meeting those expectations. If they choose to meet them, I think that's going to come with the territory.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it sounds like really having a willingness to engage more with customers. And if you're in energy storage or you're trying to get into energy storage, that is really going to be a must in terms of expect that you are going to have to spend additional time educating your clients, and it's worthwhile to do so, because it makes your job easier in making sure that you're giving the client exactly what they need. They probably appreciate, I'd imagine, the additional time and customization of their system, and more so, I mean, some of the best leads are referrals. So the amount of time that you're investing with that client and making sure that they understand what they're purchasing and that they have what they need in the event of a grid outage, ensures that they refer you to their neighbor and to their, family members and friends. So it's really great. And
Right.
Yeah, Justine, and I do have another question for you. So, but go ahead, Justine.
Well, I saw this question pop up while Stan was talking, and it all kind of relates together when it comes to your company reputation and the codes and standards. It's it's all linked, because this is new stuff. And it seemed like one of our people are asking, well, you can park your Tesla in your garage. Why are you worried about another 20 kilowatt hours being mounted there as well? And I got so excited that question came up, because it has to do with codes and standards, which I'm really getting involved in. And I'm happy that our industry is taking a cautious approach, because it is companies that are going to be going out there and selling this stuff that's going to be on the front lines of dealing with any problems. Okay. And so it's not a funny thing, but Joe Schwartz, who's our editor, the head of Solar Pro magazine and Home Power, where I worked for many years, he owns a Chevy Bolt. And I don't know if you guys have heard about the recalls between LG Chem battery packs that happened a couple months ago, but it also related to the Chevy Bolt. Well, he got a notice that he's not supposed to park his Bolt, because he's on a certain production line for a certain year, in his garage anymore. Okay, so there could be problems with battery cells, even with the cars, that are also can relate to the battery packs in this recall. So while we understand what you're saying, well, why isn't this a problem with cars? Well, it could be. I mean, these cells are being manufactured in a number of different places, and maybe they haven't gone through the same safety regulations that they needed to at that time. These cells could be multiple years old before they're actually getting parked in your driveway or mounted on your wall. And the codes and standards are trying to get ahead of this curve, okay, of all this deployment that's happening. And they're making recommendations now, because we have had some incidences in the industry with impacts, with the firefighters being hurt because of a large energy storage explosion. And I would just say, as industry professionals, we should get behind these safety regulations. It's not that we're trying to stop the the industry from growing. We're just trying to make sure that everybody, as much as possible, can be safe in their homes for where we're installing this stuff, or for our businesses where we're the ones responsible for it. And so it's a process. We're not there yet. We're working on it, and also you can install it in your garage, but you just have to find a heat detector listed to handle, because that this is residential code issue that's come up, that's coming into play for California, and it's something we're duking out in the industry right now. But I think ultimately this patience that Stan mentioned comes into play. All of us together need to be patient with this process, with our industry ramping up to meet this growth, and everybody getting on, the education that they need, and educating the clients and educating ourselves, and getting involved in the codes and standards to help this be a successful industry moving forward and meet the demands of 2021 and 2022 with resiliency and energy, clean energy, on all fronts. So I looped it around a lot of ways, but that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it is so important to stay on top of these things, like what you were talking about with the heat detectors. And no, it's supposed to be heat alarm, because the detector just detects, doesn't actually sound an alarm if there's no alarm attached to it. So I've been sitting in those conversations, and it's fascinating to see how some of the language in the codes and standards gets written. And there is so much that goes into it. I mean, literally, I've been in calls where we're sitting there for an hour debating one sentence, and like, oh, should this be an and or an or? And we'll have, and it sounds so silly, but then when you read through those language, you start to see the implications of what that means in reality and in real life. The heat detector one is a funny one, because they put that in the code, and then there is no such thing that exists. So that's something that's being mitigated. But I did want to turn real quick back to just the customer, in terms of we did have another question, and this might be the last question of are you seeing more clients, wanting generators, or what type of different solutions? And I think the other thing that comes to mind in my mind is actually these smart panels. Are you guys also using smart panels to kind of mitigate the load concerns? Stan, Justine? Yeah, go ahead.
We've had one project where we've used a smart panel, but I do see that as a place where systems will likely evolve as people have to live with these systems, right? I wanted to, Justine touched on a really important point in terms of the codes and standards and getting these systems permitted. San Francisco, where we're at, adopted the California Fire Code mid-cycle code change in July 1st of 2018, and all of a sudden you could no longer install 2 power walls for a residential system. And we had sold and designed and permitted a lot of those systems, and were not able to install them, and had to go back and re-engineer and re-permit for 1 power wall systems, because it wasn't possible to install more than 20 kilowatt hours of lithium ion batteries. And so, it feels very similar to the nascent beginnings of solar PV permitting, and the uncertainty of this new technology and it tying into the electrical panel. Mm-hmm. And how fire departments interact with that, having something combustible or potentially combustible with thermal run inside the house or outside of the house or adjacent to the house. So it's the codes and standards and the interpretation of those codes and standards is an incredible impediment to the deployment of energy storage, whether it's paired or not. And so, generators, we are seeing people look at generators. That hurts my heart, because that's more fossil fuel being burned that just contributes to this cycle of problems.
Mm-hmm. I'm really glad you brought up, really gave the point of how critical it is to understand the codes and standards, with the example, of what that means if you don't catch it, of having to go back and redo and redesign, and not being able to install what you had originally designed because of not being aware of that. So that's a huge learning from that experience. And we are at the end of the hour, so I do want to offer to everyone, Justine mentioned it earlier, one of the reasons that we are offering these educational workshops for storage is exactly for this reason of, we've been hearing from a lot of other, industry professionals, or from our own clients, and asking for support of how do we navigate all of these codes and standards from a design perspective. So we've put together a series of workshops. It's going to be 2 private workshops per quarter. And the different subjects are on the screen right now. So going over NFPA codes for ESS, of different products, design considerations, like should you do AC coupled or DC coupled? Is there a generator that already exists there that you have to work into it? What does that look like? And then actually implementing NEC into the design. So definitely check out those workshops if you're interested. We also just posted the very first one on heat spring. So if you're wanting to just do it online and not really have the one-on-one time with us, you can do that. And the link is in the chat. We obviously have so much more to talk about. I know in prepping for this, we mentioned, wanting to do this again. So I think that's in the works. We might be continuing this conversation to just dive more into maybe the permitting side of things and the design side of things. I want to thank you both, Stan and Jeanine, so much for joining us today. It was wonderful talking and hearing your insights about what's going on in Texas and California.
Yeah, thank you all for having us, and thanks to all the attendees. So great questions, and
thank you both so much.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much.
And don't miss our next AMA. Ryan, if you want to pull that slide back up, our next month's AMA topic is going to be megawatt design considerations. We're going to have Randy Batchelor with Soul Rebel on as our guest. He's a good friend of ours and teaches the megawatt design class with Ryan on heat spring. And that session, we're specifically going to start diving into inverter load ratios, really looking at, these increased inverter load ratios. 1.3 used to be the standard, then now 1.5 is getting up there, and I've heard 2 is even being done. What situations would you use an inverter ratio that high? And then also ground coverage ratio. So check that out next month. And again, thank you everyone for joining us today. This is recorded and we'll be posting it. We really appreciate your engagement and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks.
See y'all. Thank you.